We begin this morning with a troubling but a definite trend in this country, and that is the rise of the white supremacy movement. Experts say the number of hate groups in the United States has doubled over the past 2 decades, and that a new generation of white nationalism is being run now by millennials. Right now in Wisconsin, a man named Paul Nehlen is actually running for Congress in an effort to replace Congressman Paul Ryan. Mr. Nehlen has been criticized after openly embracing the slogan, "It's okay to be white," which happens to be a motto of the white supremacist David Duke. Nehlen also tweeted that he was reading the book, The Culture of Critique, widely considered to be anti-Semitic. The Huffington Post recently reporting that Nehlen refused to answer whether he considers himself a white nationalist after being asked 3 times. White supremacist movements have been linked to deadly attacks that have made national headlines, including just this past August, when a protest in Charlottesville, Virginia, left Heather Heyer, a counter-protester, dead. While fear of terror attacks from radicalized Islamic groups is talked about almost daily in the news, the Center for Investigative Reporting says from 2008 to 2016, far-right extremist groups were behind twice as many attacks in America, averaging more than a dozen a year. And now one man is speaking out about his commitment to the white supremacy movement, indeed his leadership of it, beginning at age 14. For years, Christian Picciolini was immersed in a life of hate. And while the stories he tells are chilling, the lessons he now says he learned are equally important. Here's his story. This 1993 performance shows the power of hate. Christian Picciolini performing his song with his band, Final Solution.
It's very easy for a young person who may have come from a normal life to be sucked into a movement like that of hate.
Growing up just outside Chicago in the city of Blue Island, Illinois, Picciolini says his parents worked hard to support their family.
They had to work 7 days a week, sometimes 14 hours a day, and I didn't see them very often, so I had started to feel abandoned, which is why I went in search for a new family somewhere else.
A chance encounter with a neighbor who was a leader in the neo-Nazi movement would eventually fill that void.
I was standing in an alley one day smoking a joint, and a man came up to me, and he pulled a joint from my mouth, and he looked me in the eyes and he said, "That's what the communists and the Jews want you to do to keep you docile."
It wasn't long before Picciolini says his entire world was filled with violence and bigotry. Devoting his life to the white supremacist movement, he rose in the movement's ranks to become one of its leaders.
Recruiting people back in those days, I mimicked how I was recruited. I knew that these young people, like myself, were looking for an identity, a community, and a purpose. And I would zero in on the cracks that were happening in their lives, the voids that were missing.
Picciolini fronted bands using violent lyrics to pull in even more recruits.
The music that we wrote, the lyrics that I put out into the world were very effective at bringing young people together who were angry and making them more angry. I committed acts of violence. I directed other people to be violent. We were a domestic terrorist organization. We were thinking about things like robbing armored cars or stealing weapons to fund a revolution or to take down our own government. I mean, these were things that we were thinking about and actively interested in putting together.
But it wasn't until he became a father that he says he started to question the path he had chosen.
When I held my child for the first time in my arms, not only did I reconnect with my innocence, but it made me question whether my identity was as a hate monger, somebody who was violent on the streets, or was I a father and a husband.
But what happened in Picciolini's life after that surprised even him. And Christian joins me now. Christian, thank you for being here.
It's a pleasure, Megan.
So before we talk about your reform, let's talk about getting sucked into the movement. When you got recruited by the guy who you say made you feel like you belonged.
Right.
That's what everyone is looking for, a sense of belonging.
Exactly.
Did you find that the others in the movement were there for the same reasons, or had they more been bred to hate?
You know, I've, from my own personal experience and from the hundreds of people that I've worked with, the number one driving force for people to join extremist movements is a really broken search for identity community, and purpose. And that's a fundamental search that everybody goes through. And if we hit enough of what I call potholes, those things that just nudge our path in life, and those could be trauma, it could be abuse, it could be a whole sort of things, mental illness. If they don't have a good navigator to get around those potholes or don't have the resources to get out of them, sometimes the only thing left is to gravitate towards these negative groups.
You talk about how there were moments while you were in it where you had doubt, where you had the thought of, what am I doing?
Sure.
And this feels wrong. Talk about the assault outside of McDonald's.
Yeah, well, first of all, there wasn't a day I think that went by that I didn't question what I was involved in, because I wasn't raised as a racist. My parents are Italian immigrants who came to the U.S. in the mid-'60s, and they were often the victims of prejudice. The assault in the McDonald's one night with some friends, we were drinking and went into a restaurant and saw some African-American teenagers standing in line. And I proclaimed very loudly that it was my restaurant and that they needed to leave. And of course they ran out and we chased them. And as they were running across the street, one of them pulled out a gun and started to shoot at us. And the gun jammed. And when we caught this individual, we beat him very, very badly until we heard the sirens from the police cars. But I had a moment where I connected with that individual as he was on the ground and I was hurting him, that made me feel empathy for him. And I don't know where it came from, but I connected with that individual when he opened his eyes and looked at me. And I thought it could have been my brother or my mother or my father. And suddenly the empathy started to overwhelm me, and that was the last time I committed an act of violence.
Before the break, we heard the story of Christian Picciolini, who, by his own description, descended into a life of racism and hate before he turned his life around. His new book is called White American Youth: My Descent into America's Most Violent Hate Movement and How I Got Out. Talk about that, Christian. You talk about that light bulb moment while you were beating a man.
Yeah.
But what was it that finally did it for you to say, I don't want this?
Ultimately, Megan, it was about the compassion that I received from the people that I least deserved it from when I least deserved it. And these were people who were African American, who were Jewish, who were gay, who took it upon themselves, even though they knew what I was about, to kind of look inside me and see what was really fueling it. And then addressing that through empathy and compassion. And then suddenly I started to realize that I had more in common with the people I thought were enemies than I did with the people who I thought were friends.
You got a job at IBM.
I did.
There was an African-American security guard there
Yeah.
with whom you had a meaningful encounter. Tell us.
Yeah. So, just as a stroke of luck, after going through a depression, a friend urged me to do something different. So I applied for a job at IBM where she worked, and I thought she was crazy because I didn't think I would ever get a job there, having been to 6 high schools and gotten kicked out of every one of them and never going to college. But my first job on my first day was to install the computer systems at a high school, my old high school, the same one I got kicked out of twice. And I was horrified because I knew that somebody was going to recognize me. Even though I had left the movement 5 years prior, I was terrified that I was going to get outed. And I didn't know what to do. And of course, within the first few minutes, the African-American security guard, Mr. Holmes, who I'd gotten in a fist fight with that got me kicked out the second time, walked right by me. And I didn't know what to do. I was scared. I had never really talked about my past. I tried to outrun it. But I knew I needed to do something. So I chased him. I followed him to the parking lot. And when I tapped him on the shoulder, he recognized who I was. And after talking, I could only formulate 2 words, and that was, I'm sorry. Because I couldn't think of what else to say to this man who I'd hurt. And he listened to me and he embraced me. And he made me promise that I would tell my story to anybody who would listen. And I did that in my book. It's a cautionary tale, not just about young white kids that could go into white supremacy. It really is the story about every young person who's looking to belong and finds that in the wrong place.
What are you seeing? Because I know you're still connected to these networks in that you study them and you
Yes.
try to reform people now who
Yes.
feel as you used to feel.
Right.
What are you seeing about what's happening in our country right now?
Well, I've worked with over 100 people to help them disengage from hate groups and hate movements. And what I'm seeing today is a massive growth in these movements with young people. It has become a social movement. And because of the internet and because of how easy it is to stumble on to propaganda or fake news or to be influenced by that, a lot of young people who feel marginalized, who may feel disenchanted, are now starting to gravitate to this movement that does promise identity, community, and a perceived purpose. And it's a very dangerous time because I'm seeing more and more young people gravitate towards this ideology of what we're calling the alt-right or white nationalism. But one thing I want to make clear...
Do you see those two terms as synonymous?
I do see them as synonymous. However, I also see them as terms that those groups made up themselves, that they actually sat around a table and said, how can we refer to ourselves to make us seem less hateful? We used to do that 30 years ago. We used to call ourselves white separatists or white pride, when in reality it was about white supremacy. So these white nationalist groups and these alt-right groups today are essentially a better packaged version of what we were 30 years ago, because we recognized even then that our shaved heads and our tattoos were turning away the average American white racist who thought we were too edgy. So we decided then, 30 years ago, to blend in, to start to grow out our hair, to trade in our boots for suits, to go to college campuses, to recruit, to even get jobs in the military and in law enforcement, and to look and sound like the people we wanted to recruit.
There, of course, during the 2016 campaign was a question about whether then candidate Trump was not vocal enough in condemning David Duke, which he did do, but that was after he didn't do it, and there was sort of some back and forth. Do you believe that there were dog whistles by our now president to white supremacists? I
do believe that there were dog whistles, but to somebody like me, I can tell you that that's a bullhorn. I heard them loud and clear. When they referred to globalism, I knew that they were talking about the global Jewish conspiracy. When they used terms like the liberal media, those are terms that we used to use, but we used to call it the Jewish media. They've learned to massage their language to make it more palatable.
Can I just say, I mean, you know, having worked at Fox News for 13 years, we used to criticize the MSM. Some would call them the liberal media, and it didn't mean that. It meant, you know, left-leaning or people who were not open-minded to, you know, the views of half the country, conservative people.
That's also the power of their marketing and how they can take words that are hateful and massage them to get them into the lexicon to make it normalized.
So you pick something that is okay, a term that is like not... that has nothing to do with white supremacy, and you adopt it.
Right.
And to your people, it has a very different meaning.
Absolutely.
Like with a wink and a nod.
To the people that I was involved with, you know, 30 years ago, that is a high five. That is a license to go out and be more violent. And that's why we're seeing a rise in hate crimes, because they feel as though the administration today, if they're not supportive of it, are at least turning a blind eye to it.
There's so much more to discuss, including exactly how we stop. Right? How does somebody like Christian get somebody out of that ideology in the way he got out? We're going to talk about that, and also we'll have an unusual reunion after the break when Christian will see someone for the first time in 25 years who once shared his ideology of hate.